Alright, this is an impromptu stream, so might as well just jump into it. I didn't think I was going to do a stream today just because the theme is think. That's a huge topic in general, right? Yeah, Roland, it's just going to be me sitting here thinking a lot of this, uh-huh, the whole time. 30 minutes. Nothing but the highest quality content here. So think is a huge topic to talk about because oh, my dog's angry. Thinking is everything. I'm a cognitive psychologist by trade. So if you don't know, my day job is I'm a psychologist. And whenever I tell people I'm a psychologist, they think a therapist. They think of a counselor. So they think of somebody who can help you with your problems. And I can't do that. That's not my training. My training is in cognitive psychology and cognitive sciences in general are interested in the study of processing information, aka thinking, right? That's what it means to like cognition is thinking. So obviously it's the psychology of thinking. Um, and there's a lot to talk about with the psychology of thinking. I mean, I couldn't possibly cover it in one stream because I got a whole degree in it. It took me a while to get it. So I want to just try and burn through some like quick thoughts that just come to my mind when thinking about cog psych and RPGs. Um, so if you have questions or thoughts or anything like that that are outside of the purview of cognitive psychology, I probably won't speak to them just because I don't want to speak outside of my space of expertise, so to speak. Um, but there's a lot in cognitive psychology that we can learn, and I have prepared absolutely nothing, so I'm just going to go from the top of the head in terms of what I think is important to keep in mind when you are designing or playing RPGs. I'm glad Raph is here because I've got your tweets pulled up here in terms of your questions that you had for me, which is these were great questions. And it makes sense that we are kindred spirits, as you've said here, because you have a background in UX design. A lot of my friends who got cognitive degrees went on into tech, specifically in user experience. So we are kindred spirits 100%. And you have a background in behavioral economics. So we're we think about it and analyze the world in very similar ways to one another. So lots of really great questions here. What are the most important foundational site concepts an RPG designer should know? Whew, that's big. That's tricky, right? Um, you mentioned this Kuleshov effect, which I wasn't familiar with. I had to look it up real quick before this. It's a filmmaking technique I learned about, as you've described here, how to construct stories based off of like having scenes sort of juxtaposed next to each other or shots juxtaposed, which is really neat. You talk about IO psych, industrial organizational psychology. It's booming right now. It's very popular. Uh, and then this stuff down here, cognitive load. I think this is where I'm going to start and what I'm going to start talking about, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But cognitive load is the interesting one to me. That's the one that jumps out the most. Um, so what do we mean by cognitive load? Um, this is something that a lot of folks talk about in terms of games either that have too much that like tax your cognitive load or have tools that offload cognitive load. And what do they mean when they're talking about that? Most of the time, what people are talking about is there's a lot of different terms that we could use. The term that I'm going to use is working memory capacity. So, working memory capacity is this concept that basically our memory is broken up into three, let's just call it three for now for simplicity's sake, major parts. Sensory memory, that's the stuff that your eyes, ears, all that just saw, just heard like half a second ago. Short-term memory and then long-term memory. And then short-term memory is much more complicated than just calling it short-term, so we nowadays call it working memory. Um, Short-term memory is A lot of people use the word short-term memory, and they usually think it's something like something that happened an hour ago or like yesterday. That's your short-term memory. That's actually not true. Your short-term memory, aka your working memory, is whatever you're actively thinking about right now. It's your conscious thought. If we were to use the analogy of a computer, short-term memory is the RAM of the computer, right? Where there's kind of two different types of memory or storage on your computer. You've got the hard drive that holds all your files and stuff, and then things are pulled and accessed and go into RAM, right? And RAM works with stuff, and that's whatever the computer's actively thinking about at the time. That's what our short-term memory is. So our short-term memory is limited. And that's what we mean by working memory capacity or things like cognitive load. There's only so much that it can do, just like the RAM on a computer. So the general rule of thumb when we think about capacity is time and amount. Generally, time-wise, your short-term memory is like 30 seconds. 30 seconds to like a minute. So anybody who usually uses the idea that short-term memory, oh, this is what happened yesterday. I have such bad short-term memory. Yesterday is long-term memory. That's ages ago in terms of your memory. Short-term memory is whatever you're immediately consciously thinking about, and then the second you stop thinking about it, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't evaporate. It just slowly kind of degrades away. In a similar sense, that's how our memories generally work. They don't degrade, they don't like rot in our brains. They actually, the paths to those memories get blocked. It's the theories nowadays think about memory as a interference focus rather than a degradation of your memories. So like there's all in there. It's just finding the path to get to the memory. Um, so cognitive load is this short period of time that you can be actively thinking about something. Now, if you're actively thinking about something, it's not like if you were thinking about somebody's name and you just kept repeating their name for 30 seconds, you run out of time and then the name just goes away from your head. As long as you're actively thinking about something, it will stay with you. It's in short-term memory. It's in your cognitive load. It's in your working memory. But it's when you stop actively rehearsing it that we start the stopwatch. And the other thing that we think about with load is how much, right? So you've got a time limit on how long you can do this. How much can you hold? The general rule of thumb is Miller's magic number, which is 7. 7 plus or minus 2 items. Unique items. What do I mean by unique items? It could be something as simple as numbers, right? It could be 7 numbers that you can remember. Hey, how long are phone numbers? If we ignore like area code, they're 7 numbers. That's why we can generally hold them in our heads. But it's plus or minus 2. So really we have sort of a range of 5 to 9 things that we can keep in our head at a given time. Now, you're probably thinking, Spencer, that's just flat out not true. I can definitely hold more than 9 things in my head at one time. And that's true. You can do that. The reason you can do that, the reason you can overcome this cognitive load limitation, so to speak, is by things called chunking. And this is something that we can start thinking about from an RPG perspective, is chunking. Chunking is a horrible term. It's really, I hate that this is the word that we use, but chunking is the combination of similar ideas, similar like related items and things like that in working memory so that you can combine them together. So, for example, a telephone number in the United States, for example, is actually 10 numbers, right? It's the 3 numbers of the area code and then the 7 numbers that follow. And 10 is beyond our limit, technically. It's 5 to 9 on average. But how are we able to remember phone numbers? Well, because we chunk area codes into like a single unit, because it's probably an area code that you're familiar with, like if you're learning the number of somebody who lives in the same area as you. So you can chunk that. And so now it goes from 10 items to 8 items. That's within our limit. So how can we use this information with RPGs? Well, let's just think about situations in which you have a lot of information in your head. How can you chunk that? Well, we need to think about situations where you would have a lot of information that you need to hold on to in the first place. The thing that always comes to mind when I'm thinking about cognitive load is any game that is position and combat focused that doesn't have a map. Theater of the mind is a huge tax on your cognitive load. because you have to hold in your head the relative positioning of a whole bunch of nebulous things that not everybody can see at the same time. Um, and so, how can we get past this? Like, one, we see games try and get past this by using things like relative range, right? Like, we see those maps that have range bands on them so that everything here is close, everything here is like far, everything here is super far. That's helpful. Um, there's a cool idea going around about using like areas and zones that people are in and paths instead of a gridded map. I know that Adira Slattery uses something similar to that with like areas in Gunfucks, so that if you want to like track where a whole bunch of baddies are, because like in Gunfucks it's like Borderlands, you're just mowing down fools, right? But how are you supposed to keep track of 20 bad guys and then like where your allies are and where you are in an imaginary space? Well, you just put them into areas, right? You just name these areas and then you chunk these people into these areas, and now you're holding much less information in your head. Your RAM can handle that. So that's an example of chunking in like real time, right? And that's where we see it. The other big place for cognitive load is your character sheet, right? Your character sheet is supposed to be where you're supposed to be able to just dump all of the necessary information about your character as possible. In some games, that is easier or better done than others, right? A game that has like specific powers and abilities and spells and things like that that you have that are also on your sheet, like laid out in detail, that's great. It's going to really reduce your cognitive load. If you've got a sheet like in D&D, like I used to run and play D&D, and if you played like a wizard and you had 6 spells, you probably didn't have them all written out in full detail of what they did. You just had the names. So it's not a huge cognitive load lifter for you because you're inevitably going to have to go look into the book for it. Um, but I'll say the advantage of D&D is that you've got a gridded map usually, and so that's going to take care of at least all the spatial reasoning you're going to have to do. So, what is all that telling us? From like a cognitive load perspective, think of our brains like computers. We've got hard drives in there that hold all of our information that we think about, our memories. We've got RAM, which is called short-term memory or executive control or working memory capacity. There's a lot of phrases that all generally mean the same thing. That's your RAM. That's whatever you're currently thinking about. You've got about 30 to 60 seconds with that information. The second you stop thinking about it, the timer starts, and you can hold something along the lines of 5 to 9 unrelated items in your head. That can be cheated by doing things like chunking. So designers should consider, if they've got games that have a lot of complexity going on, where can they reduce that cognitive load? If you've got highly detailed combat, then a map is probably going to be your thing. But if you don't want to do a map, then you should think about solutions to help ease the theater of the mind situation. And there's a lot of cool information out there about spatial reasoning, which is our ability to kind of perceive and think about space, like our place in space, like how far away things are and how to get to places. And we travel mental distances um, in a very similar way to we travel actual real world distances. For example, if somebody imagines a map in their head, or is even just looking at a fake map on a screen, and there's a bunch of like named locations, and you tell them, okay, move from this location to this location, and they're close. In your head, they'll imagine the trip, and it'll be short compared to if they move from here to here, really far away. They mentally take longer, even though there's no actual traveling going on. You can replicate this effect by thinking about places in your house. So if you are in your house, like imagine you're at like the front door of your apartment. For me, if I was at the front door of my apartment and I had to close my eyes and imagine walking to the bathroom, that wouldn't take me very long because it's right there. If I had to close my eyes and imagine myself going to the bedroom, that would take me a little bit longer mentally in my head, even though I'm not moving anywhere, even though I'm still just doing it all in my head. So our brains do whatever they can to try and replicate the real world as best as possible. Like our brain is a simulation machine; it's always doing that. Like take it quite literally, you shouldn't believe everything that you see with your eyes, for example, because you've got two big voids in your eyes, the spots where your optic nerve connects with your retina. You get two spots in the retina, which is responsible for giving you what you see. There's nothing there. The optic nerve is there, but the brain fills in the gap based off of what it believes it should see, based off of what's looking around. So our brain is a wonderful simulation machine. It is a computer, exactly like Roland said. It's literally cybernetics. It's pretty cool stuff. Oops, sorry about that. So let's see here. We're kind of all over the place, which is what I expected with this particular stream, just because I didn't come in with a plan. But that's sort of what I want to say about cognitive load from that question of um, cognitive load. We know the limitations both in a time and capacity perspective. Think about places that you can relieve that load in your game if you're designing or even if you're running a game, right? If you're the GM, consider this and consider the fact that everybody's load um, is different. You know, the things that I'm telling you right now, the time and the capacity and all that, those are averages. They are not the experience of everybody in the world. There's always going to be variance in that. And so keep that in mind as a designer and a GM if you're ever interested in that sort of stuff. So I think cognitive load is the thing that I like super wanted to talk about. This is really interesting. This Kuleshov effect thing. I looked it up for just a second. It's basically the idea of like juxtaposing scenes against each other. It reminds me a lot of a concept in psychology, an old concept called structuralism. It's not particularly popular nowadays, but it was this idea that you could combine human experiences and emotions and things like that, like you could combine elements of the periodic table. And essentially, you know how you combine elements to make alloys and to make new things? Same thing. There were early psychologists were desperate to try and mimic other sciences, and so they tried to come up with this sort of periodic table of human experiences and emotions so that you could add them together to create every possible combination. Um, so if you saw like a happy face plus blank equals, or no, like the example I always use in class is a rising sun, like the sun, like a sunrise plus blank equals smiley. Like what during the morning makes you happy? I fill in the blank with coffee. That was a thing that psychologists were really interested in trying to do for a while. Didn't stick to that for too long. That's not how we it's not how we experience life. Um, but the Kuleshov effect does talk, it has a lot to do with like inferences, right? Inferences, our ability to infer information based off of incomplete information. My advisor in grad school did a lot of research on inferences before I was one of his students. It's cool stuff. What do I think is the most important foundational psych concepts? So the things that I think are most interesting are cognitive load, which we talked a lot about, intelligence. And in terms of intelligence, I mean don't put it in your game. Essentially, we have this obsession with assessing things here in the States and just generally speaking. And so the assessment of intelligence is it's a fool's errand. There are too many different types of intelligence out there to have them boil down to a concept like intellect or intelligence in your game. It's when you have a stat like intelligence in a game, it echoes the sentiments of this concept called G. G is also known as general intelligence. For a while, early intelligence researchers believed that there was this concept called G, which is just basically like a core intelligence that you have, that you're just generally smart, and that if you have a high G, you're going to probably be pretty good at a lot of things. And if you have a low G, you're probably not going to be good at most things. Where does that come from? It comes from IQ, because IQ tried to boil intelligence down to a measurable number. IQ is a garbage test. It has history in racism, similar to early measurements of individual differences with so Binet and Galton and people like that were really interested in that sort of stuff. So just get rid of intelligence as a measurement in your games, because you're not just like smart or not smart. That's It's, again, not how the brain works. So cognitive load, thinking about how you can design towards it, easing it where you can as a designer, as a GM, removing intelligence as a general concept, or trying to represent intelligence in multiple fashions, much like how it actually manifests in the real world. The other thing that I think is really interesting is problem solving. And so what I mean by problem solving, I've talked about this on like some Psych of RPGs videos I did a long time ago on YouTube. I occasionally bring this stuff up again, but problem solving is fascinating to me. Problem solving is decision making with an obstacle. If you want to make a decision about something and something is stopping you from making that decision, you're in problem solving space. Um, and how does problem solving work? Well, it depends on the type of problem. There are well-defined problems and ill-defined problems. Well-defined problems are problems where the goal is clear, you know what you're trying to accomplish, and the rules in which you can play to get to that goal are also clear. You have clear constraints. Ill-defined problems either have an unclear goal, but they could have very clear rules, you just don't know how to get to the end, or they are unclear in the constraints, unclear in the rules, but the goal is clear, or nothing is clear. Let me give you an example. Matchstick problem. So matchstick problem is an example of a this is an example of an ill-defined problem. So what is this problem saying? It says move only one matchstick to fix the equation. What does that mean? Well, the rules are very clear. You're going to move one matchstick, one of these matchsticks, to make a true math problem. But what does it mean to be a true math problem, or what is a true math problem? Well, there's an infinite number of them, turns out, right? Like, we have an infinite number of math problems that are true, technically, that you could create. So the rules are very clear, but the goal is unclear. You don't know what the problem is supposed to look like at the end, other than the fact that it has to be a correct fixed equation. This is what I would call an ill-defined problem. A well-defined problem, like I said, very clear rules, very clear constraints. A well-defined problem, nope, not the coolest shop we just looked at that, is a Sudoku. A Sudoku is a clear, well-defined problem. The rules are clear, the goal is clear, there's no room for interpretation. When you think about problem solving in your RPGs, I mean, problem solving is everywhere, right? We think about problem solving as this usually like this big thing, but it's not. We solve problems at a small scale, at a large scale, constantly. And so, as designers or GMs, GMs love to make puzzles and problems for players. Think about, do you want your problem, first of all, to be a well-defined or an ill-defined problem? Do you want the rules to be very clear, a goal, a very obvious goal? Or do you want something more like an ill-defined problem where maybe the goal is clear, or maybe the rules are clear, maybe neither are clear, but there's some shades of gray, some interpretation. The OSR loves this, right? The OSR scene loves this because it's focused on player skill, right? There's usually the GM doesn't even know what the answer to the problem is. They just kind of let the players poke around until it seems like the problem gets solved, and it comes through player skill rather than character skill. Like, your characters aren't necessarily rolling to just like solve the puzzle, which is something you might have if you have like an intelligence skill. Instead, it's you're just gonna like smash your face into this until you figure it out, and then the GM goes, "Yeah, you figured it out." So when you're deciding on how to put problems in your games, you want to think about this in terms of how much do you want to lean on character skill and player skill. The other thing you want to consider about is heuristics and strategies. Heuristics and strategies. A heuristic is a shortcut, essentially. We use shortcuts to try and quickly solve things or make decisions, because if we went through the actual laborious like 5-step model of decision making every time we made decisions, we would get nothing done. So heuristics help speed up that process. The 3 heuristics that I generally like to talk about in the problem solving space, and you can think about them as a designer, as a GM, are there different types of problems that I can create where some of these heuristics would work and some of them wouldn't? And then, once you understand that as a designer or a GM, how to put in different types of problems so that you don't allow the same heuristic to be the solution every single time. This is, again, if you want to think about having a lot of problem solving in your games. But problem solving doesn't have to be literally like math problems. It could be problem solving in a combat space, right? Like, how are you going to win this fight other than just shooting or slapping the other people until they're dead, right? You can create problems that they have to overcome. This is what goes back to the tactics conversation. So the three heuristics that I like to think about it, you should think about as a designer or a GM, is um, the means end strategy or heuristic, which is you know what your big goal is. You're going to break it up into smaller sub goals. Your players should be able to break it up into smaller sub goals that as they accomplish those sub goals, they check, all right, we just got the sub goal. Did it bring us closer to getting to the end goal? If it did, then good. I'm glad we worked on the sub goal. If it didn't, then maybe the sub goal was a distraction. Maybe it's we're not going down the right path. We should consider different approaches, different sub goals. Thank you, Raph, for following. I appreciate that. So, a big problem that can be broken down into sub goals is nice because you get that drip feed of dopamine as you're solving problems. The players feel good as they're like making progress. They might not have won the fight right away, but they're chipping away at it, and that feels good. You know that you're getting somewhere. So means end strategy are problems that can be broken up into smaller pieces, digestible pieces that can be identified and tackled kind of like sequentially or in parallel with one another. Hill climbing approach is literally run straight to the finish line. Ignore everything in your path. Just like climb over and bust through every obstacle in your path. Hill climbing strategy basically says if you have the option between two paths, and one path is the straighter line towards the finish line, and this one kind of wavers a little bit, you take the straight line. Even if ultimately that straight line is going to run you right into a brick wall that's not going to let you get to the finish line, you're going to try that path first. Hill climbing is especially useful in smaller problem solving spaces. So if there's not a wide variety of paths to solve the problem, hill climbing from a player's perspective or a problem solver's perspective is usually the best route to go because you can just brute force your way into the solution. And if the problem space is small, brute forcing and it not working isn't a huge detriment because there's only a couple other paths you need to check anyway. So occasionally it's good to put these problems in our games where the players could just beeline through them. That is also okay. It doesn't have to be this long thing because that feels good sometimes to just be like, oh, the direct route worked. Cool. Didn't expect that. That's a nice thing to switch things up. The last thing is working backwards. Working backwards is where the players can see the goal in their heads, they know what the goal is, and they can think about what the step just before that looks like, and they can think of what the step just before that looks like, and the step before that, and the step before that, and then they just reverse it, right? They know how to work backwards, and so they just kind of play out the act in that order. Working backwards only works with well-defined problems, though. You can't work backwards from this matchstick problem. It's impossible, right? Because you don't know what the solution looks like. If you don't know what the fixed equation looks like, you can't think about what the step just before that looks like. So it really only works in those well-defined situations, clear goal, clear constraints, and also, again, kind of smaller problem spaces. Bigger problem spaces, you can do the working backwards technique, but our brains are only capable of thinking about so many different paths, and so you would probably need like a computer to do it algorithmically instead of our brains to save yourself spaces. So that's the third thing. Those are kind of the three things that I think are really important to consider with psychology and RPGs is cognitive load, our capacity and limitations of it, and how we as game designers and GMs can help alleviate it for our players. The concept of intelligence being a kind of a gross thing as something that's measured or boiled down to a single attribute, and so we should either eliminate it or represent it through multiple intelligences, which is the generally considered approach, like Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, or even just the split between things like crystal and fluid intelligence, crystal being sort of like solid facts that you just know, like dates and names, and fluid intelligence, which is going to be that problem solving creativity, working with incomplete information. Book smarts, street smarts, if you really want to dilute it down. And the third thing being problem solving. And as GMs and game designers, problem solving is not just puzzles, it's every aspect of the game. And that there are different types of problems, and that we as designers and GMs should try and mix that up and think about these heuristics, these strategies that are used, and also mix that up in terms of what works and how we encourage our players to approach problems. So that's what I really wanted to. I mean, I guess I didn't really want to talk about anything because I didn't know what I was going to talk about. But Raph had these excellent questions, and so I wanted to make sure I covered them. I see the notifications, and I don't know if that means people are responding to this or not, or if they're responding to other things. Looks like other stuff, so I'll look at this later. But that's it. That's thinking and psychology, at least in 30 minutes, right? That's what we can do in 30 minutes, which is pretty good, right? I I'm actually this term teaching a psychology of role-playing games class in which I at least have some more time to teach these concepts. But I hope that those three lessons of cognitive load, intelligence, and problem solving can be helpful or interesting to you as a designer, as a game master, or even as a player, right? We're all in this. We're all playing make believe and thinking about these things, and I think we can learn a little bit from psychology's perspective on that stuff. Um, this doesn't even like come close to the ideas of role playing as therapy and stuff like that. There's a lot of cool research out there, but like I said, that's not my area of psychology, so I don't want to speak too much about it just because there are other experts out there who can cover that. So unless folks have any questions, stuff that I didn't cover that you is like a burning question or anything like that, that feels like a pretty good space to wrap up thinking. Raph, I want to give you a shout out. I really appreciate the questions. That's super awesome. I didn't think I was gonna think about anything today, and then you had these really inspiring questions, and so I was just I read them and I was like, you know what? Let's talk about it. Let's do it. Um, yeah, take my psych of RPGs class. I got to figure out a way to like get it so that my friends and fellow game designers can just audit it. Figure out like a recorded Skype you in sort of thing. I'm not. It's not starting for a few weeks, so maybe I can still figure that out. All right, wonderful. Well, let's wrap it up here. Thanks so much everybody for joining, for questions, for hanging out and talking about thinking. I had a lot of fun. This is my area of expertise. This is what I got my degree in. So every once in a while, it's exciting to kind of just go into professor mode and talk about psychology. So this was wonderful. Thank you all. Have yourselves a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is you are. Hopefully I'll be on tomorrow to talk about flood. Not sure what we're going to talk about, but we'll figure something out. Have yourselves a wonderful day. Bye, everybody.